Welcome everyone. A quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Wabagal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides and where we in the room are located today. Our presenter today, Dr. James Hunter, is the Australian National Maritime Museum's Curator of Naval Heritage and Archaeology. He's been involved in the fields of historical and maritime archaeology for over 2 decades and has participated in the investigation of several internationally significant shipwreck sites in the United States, including the American Civil War submarine H.L. Hunley, and the Emmanuel Point shipwreck, a Spanish galleon wrecked in Pensacola Bay, Florida in 1559, as well as shipwreck surveys of Australia's first submarine, AE-1 in Papua New Guinea, the Second World War light cruiser HMAS Perth in Indonesia, and the search for and identification of the wreck site of James Cook's HMB Endeavour in the United States. He recently curated an exhibition about the shipwreck site of the early 19th century English immigrant vessel South Australian and has plans to undertake archaeological investigation of known and as yet undiscovered historical shipwrecks on Newcastle's Oyster Bank and along Stockton Beach. His paper today stems from that latter project and is titled "More Surprises Await: The Potential for Future Historic Shipwreck Archaeology on Newcastle's Oyster Bank and Surrounding Coastline." James, over to you.
Thanks, Sasha. Appreciate that.
We're using that one, so it's all good.
Well, thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here and talk a little bit about shipwrecks here in Newcastle, of which there are many. It is quite impressive, actually. It was quite stunning as started to sort of delve into this, and my interest in all of this really goes back to my background in Spanish colonial archaeology in the United States. I particularly was looking at Spanish vessels built in the New World, and that's what my master's thesis explored. And while I was kind of doing a bit of historical background on some other ships, I came across this mention of this vessel called the Extremeña, which I will get into later on. But suffice to say, this was a Spanish-built vessel, and it was built in South America in 1803, and it has a direct association with Australia and specifically Newcastle. So that's kind of what started all of this. And I'll just kind of jump into it.
If you click on the there, and now try again.
Great. Okay. So, a little bit about historic shipwrecks on the Oyster Bank and Stockton Beach. Why are they there? Well, quite simply, the entrance to the Hunter River, or the Coal River, as it was known historically, is treacherous. That is probably putting it mildly. It was an incredibly difficult passage to enter and exit, particularly for sailing vessels. And even today, it still continues to be a very difficult waterway to transit. And shipwrecks do occur. For those of you who know about the Patchwork back in the 1990s, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. The other issue is that Stockton Beach, which extends to the north of the entrance to the river for about 37 kilometers, is considered the most dangerous part of the Australian coast to approach in an easterly or southeasterly gale. If you're on a sailing vessel, it's not a good place to be. And so if you can imagine, if you've got severe weather, you're on a sail-driven vessel, and you're trying to basically thread the needle and get into the entrance of the river, very, very difficult. So the entrance of the river is bordered by Nobby's Head to the south, and what was historically called the Oyster Bank to the north. And this was basically a series of shoals and rocks that shift, of course, with tides and wave action and everything else, but was absolutely deadly to ships. So, earliest recorded shipwreck in this area is the Norfolk, 1800. Interesting history to this vessel. This is the vessel that Matthew Flinders and George Bass circumnavigated Tasmania in. It is the one that they charted that island. So very historically significant. And it was in service to the colony down towards Sydney and was operating around Hawkesbury when it was commandeered by a group of convicts who got as far north as Newcastle before they accidentally ran it aground and had to flee. Now, in terms of accumulation and numbers, this is what really, really impresses me. Because between 1800 and 1977, there was at least one ship loss in this area per decade. So that is a massive number of ships. And in fact, in 177 years, there are nearly 300 vessels lost in the approximate area of the Oyster Bank and Stockton Beach. That is phenomenal. And the really amazing thing is that you're talking about a myriad of different vessel types, vintages, and nationalities. Now, I want to show you this little graphic here because this kind of puts it in perspective for me. So what you're looking at is a satellite image of the entrance to the Hunter River. The area that's kind of in gray there that's been delineated is roughly where the majority of these shipwreck sites reside. And that's about a 3 square kilometer area. Okay. So in that area, you are talking roughly 200 to 300 shipwrecks. That's a lot. That's immense, but it gets even more interesting because this is where I cut my teeth as a maritime archaeologist. This is the Pensacola Bay system in Florida. Okay. Now, in this bay system, there are approximately the same number of shipwrecks historically documented, 300. Okay. Now, I'm going to take that 3 square kilometer area near Newcastle. There are 300 shipwrecks in that box, as opposed to 300 shipwrecks in that entire bay system that's surrounding it. That's amazing. That is what I call shipwreck concentrate. It is absolutely incredible. So there is an immense, data set to work with here, and I think that's absolutely incredible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about specific case studies and just use them as examples to explain how you could apply maritime archaeology up here in Newcastle. So I'll start with 2 shipwrecks that are actually quite well known in the area. They're sort of ghost shipwrecks. They show up and then they disappear, depending on the conditions. And that's the Dursdeer and the Berbice. Now, both of these wrecks are off Stockton Beach. They're relatively close to the breakwater. And in fact, the Berbice is sitting just off the Surf Lifesaving Club at Stockton. Very close to shore, within 200 meters of the shoreline. Now, I'm going to go through and kind of discuss the Berbice and the Dursdeer individually. So the Berbice, 707-ton ship, launched in Dumbarton, Scotland in 1868. It's a composite-built vessel, so that means it's iron-framed and it has timber planking. It was owned by John Kerr of Greenock and was basically sailed all over the world. It went to the West Indies, it went to India, it went to the Dutch East Indies, which is today's Indonesia, went to the Caribbean, all over the place, basically. And so in June 1888, it was bound from Melbourne to Newcastle in ballast. So it didn't have any cargo. It was coming up to Newcastle to pick up a consignment of coal, which it was then going to take to the west coast of the United States, San Diego. As often happened with many of these shipwreck events, it was approaching the mouth of the river in really foul weather. And so during a gale on the night of the 4th of June, 1888, it's attempting to enter the entrance to the river, got into trouble, sent up distress signals. So there were blue lights, flares, they launched all these things. But for some reason, those signals went unacknowledged by the signal station at Nobby's Head. So Captain Alexander Ross made a fairly fateful decision, and that was he was going to attempt to enter the river without a pilot. Bad idea, because this is what happened. And this happened many, many times historically. They tried to bring it in as they went around Nobby's. Vessel didn't answer its helm, so they lost steerage, basically. They lost control of the ship. They put their anchors out to try to hold their position, but basically they dragged and they went straight into the Oyster Bank. And this is something that frequently happened in southeasterly or easterly gales. Now, to give you an idea, when Berbice hit, there were already wrecks in the spot where it struck on the Oyster Bank. There was the Lismore, the Rialto, and the Susan Godfrey. So it actually bounced in around all these other shipwrecks, went across the Oyster Bank, and ended up coming aground on Stockton Beach. Luckily, the entire crew were saved, got everybody off using a breeches buoy. Now, for those of you who don't know what a breeches buoy is, and I never miss an opportunity to use art in my presentations, this is a painting by Winslow Homer called Lifeline. So the way this thing worked was they had a crew on the beach. They would launch lines towards the ship in distress using rockets. They would then make those lines fast to the ship, make them fast to the shore, and then they used what's called a breeches buoy, which is sort of a life inner tube with a harness, and they would have guys go out and take people off the ship through very tumultuous seas in many cases. And so this is what they used to save the crew of the Berbice. And this is what Berbice looked like after the storm. As you can imagine, a big draw for the public. People flocked over to Stockton to see this wreck. People are fascinated by shipwrecks. I mean, I think that's just a human condition. They find them quite compelling. Ships look very much out of place when they're sitting on land like this. And let's be quite frank, too, people flock to shipwrecks because they're looking for loot in a lot of cases. And I'm sure plenty of people probably climbed on this ship and took things they weren't supposed to take. So here's another great photograph of the Berbice aground on the beach. And just back there in the background to the right, you can actually see knobbies to kind of give you an idea where it was. Now, this is drone footage that was shot, a still from drone footage shot in 2021 by a guy named John Chesworth. And what you're looking at there is the wreck site of the Berbice in the shallows, very close to shore. And in fact, in the background, you can see the surf life saving station, just to give you an idea how close it is and where it is. So this wreck covers and uncovers depending on conditions. And I don't know its status at the moment, but I am quite interested in this site for a number of reasons. One, it's very close to shore. It's easy to access. We know where it is, which in my business means everything. It means you don't have to look for them, which gobbles up lots of time and can be mind-numbingly boring. And really, for me, one of the really great things about the Berbice, and I kind of did a little bit of research around this, is that there is an immense amount of archival information associated with the ship. Lloyd's alone has digitized documents you can get online, the survey of the ships, and it provides all the information about its construction, the sizes of the timbers used in its construction, that sort of thing. Very, very specific information that you can then take and compare to archaeological data that you recover from the wreck site. Everybody's pretty, they're pretty sure that that's the Berbice based on the location and a few other factors. But I think if you really wanted to reinforce it, you go in, you record the wreck site, you get the data, you compare that to the archival record, and that in turn gives you even more evidence to support the idea that it is the Berbice. So I think that'd be a really, really fun little project to do. Be a great master's thesis, actually. And the other thing, of course, is all ships over the course of their life were modified. They were adapted, different things were done to them. And the great thing about these Lloyd's documents is if the survey data is detailed enough, they actually tell you about those things. They tell you about the repairs that are made. Good example with the Berbice. There are openings at the bottoms of the ribs, the framing timbers in the ship called limber holes. And what those do is they allow the bilge water to flow down through the hull into the bilge so the water can be pumped out. They had problems with those holes. Normally, they're just kind of holes cut into the timber, and they had problems with them getting clogged. So what they did on the Berbice was they took ceramic pipes and they put them through the openings, and then they concreted them in place. So if you found that on the wreck, that's a really compelling piece of evidence that that's the shipwreck you've got. And again, some of the times we've got documents that give you data in terms of timber sizes and constituents, but you also get plans. And this is one of the plan documents of Berbice. It's a sectional view of the vessel. And that can be incredibly helpful too. Now, jumping to the Dursdeer, which is the wreck just to the north of the Berbice. So this is an iron-hulled bark of 988 tons, also built in Scotland, literally about 12 kilometers from where Berbice was built. So they were built on the Clyde River, roughly in the same location, and only a few years apart. It's launched earlier, 1864, as a vessel called the City of Lahore. And so for most of the beginning of its career, it's operating between India and Scotland, running in that trade until about 1880. And then ownership transfers to another individual. The vessel's renamed Durasdir. And then from that point, it starts traveling more widely internationally. So it goes to New Zealand, Australia, South America, South Africa, and the United States. Now, it happened to have gone to South Africa and was in ballast, like the Berbice was, when it was headed to Newcastle on the 22nd of December, 1895. And its wrecking event was very similar. Again, it was another attempt to try to thread the needle and get into the river during inclement weather. In this case, the vessel was actually under tow, being towed by a tug named the Stormcock. But, as happened in a few other instances, the weather was so bad and the conditions deteriorated to such an extent that the tow line parted. And as soon as that tow line went, things got real nasty very quickly. Again, as with the Berbice, there was an attempt to put anchors down to try to hold the ship's position, but the weather got the upper hand and it blew it into the Oyster Bank. And as with the Berbice, it struck in a place where another shipwreck had occurred literally the year before. In this case, a steamer called the Colonist. And remember that name because the Colonist comes into this story again later. But it bounced over, got over the bank, and was blown into Stockton Beach under very similar circumstances. So here you can see it probably just a few hours after it ran aground. Again, very compelling thing. Heaps of people down on the beach checking out what's going on. But within about 24 hours, the vessel actually fell over on its beam end. So what that means is it rolled over on its side. So here it's starting to go and gone. And so that's what it looked like literally within a day or two of it running aground. And what's really fascinating is that, again, 2021, conditions were right, wreck was uncovered, somebody got a drone up, in this case, Mr. Chesworth again, and we can see what is clearly a shipwreck. And what is absolutely phenomenal to me is that you can tell it's a ship. You can look at it, you can see the masts. Those are the lower masts still standing. They're in their original step position. And you can even see part of the bowsprit coming off to the right there at the bow. That's fantastic. And that's, when people think of a shipwreck, I'm sure that's what they think of. Not normally what I see, which is just the bottom of the hull in many cases, and a bit amorphous and doesn't really look like what you'd expect. So, Durasdir, another great archaeological project in that because of its level of intactness, because of the fact it looks like a ship or shipwreck, it would be great to do what's called photogrammetric, 3D photogrammetric reconstruction, photogrammetry. And so this is an example. That's actually me on a wreck site called the Herald in Sydney Harbor. You see my camera there. And so what photogrammetry is, for those who don't know, you have a digital camera. It takes hundreds, if not thousands, of images of a wreck site from all different orientations. You then take those digital images, put them into a software program. It finds commonalities among the images and stitches them together into a 3D model. And 3D models are great. You can use them for a lot of different things: exhibition, interpretive outcomes. You can make interactive 3D models of wreck sites that tell you what things are. And a good example of that is a wreck site in Western Australia called the Omeo. But before I get to that, so this is the Herald. You saw the photo of me earlier. This is a plan view of that wreck site. Most of it is buried. What you're looking at there are the two boilers and the engine and part of the paddle wheel shaft, which is at the top. It was a side wheel steamer. And so in this case, you can interpret the different parts of the wreck site. And one thing we were able to find out from the photogrammetry, up in the top left, down the lower left corner, you'll see that we've got rupture in the starboard hull plating and failure point in the boiler. There's actually a hole in the boiler where it failed and a big fragment was blown out of the side of the boiler and went through the side of the ship. And that's why it sank. So we see that evidence quite clearly in the 3D model. Now, this is the Mayo. This is in Western Australia, close to Perth. Same thing, very close to shore. Real no-brainer in terms of 3D photogrammetry, really good water clarity. And so what you're seeing at the top is an aerial image, and what you're seeing at the bottom is a screen capture of the 3D model. And what that does is that gives you a lot more detail. And the 3D model is actually, you can manipulate it, you can spin it around, zoom in, zoom out, look all around it. And this is just some detail of the 3D model that you can see. And so this is the kind of thing you could do with the Duras deer. It would be an absolutely awesome candidate for this type of work. Now, I've been talking about shipwrecks up to this point. I think another really interesting project would be not just one shipwreck, but a whole conglomerate of shipwrecks and a structure built of shipwrecks, and that's the Stockton Breakwater. Everyone who lives here is familiar with it, I'm sure. It goes out from the north end of the river, extends out. What you might not know is that it is predominantly made of shipwrecks. It was first proposed as a breakwater in 1858, but nothing really happened until 1898. And the whole reason that enough money and political will was finally gathered together to make this construction happen was because of shipwreck after shipwreck after shipwreck on the Oyster Bank. And they realized that they had to build something that would assist in keeping that river channel clear and would also ideally aid in vessels navigating in and out of the entrance to the harbor. So 1898, they start work on the breakwater, and it's completed in 1912. So, takes a few years to get it done. And the foundation literally is either wrecked ships or ones that were scuttled, ones that were sunk intentionally in place to provide a basis upon which the breakwater would be built. So this is an 1858 map. It's called the Moriarty Plan. And so, wish I had a laser pointer, but you can kind of see there's Stockton, and you've got this little kind of breakwater that in theory was planned. But again, nothing really happened. Because if you look at a map from 1887, you can see there at Stockton, there's a tiny little breakwater, but not the one that eventually ends up being built there. Now, Terry Callan, who's a local author, maritime historian, knew a lot about shipwrecks in Newcastle. Wrote a book called Bar Dangerous, which is really well worth reading if you get a chance. He also very helpfully created these really cool schematics that showed the different wrecks that were used to form the foundation of the Stockton Breakwater. So you've got the extent of the breakwater there to the left. That's as far as it had gone in 1898. And then you have all these vessels extending out to the east that formed the basis of the breakwater. And the one that I think is well worth looking at in a bit more detail is the Adolpha. And I'll get into that in a second. But what I think is really important about the breakwater here is the idea of site formation process. And that's not only in the development of the breakwater, but that's also in terms of specific shipwrecks or scuttled vessels that were used to create that breakwater. So what's site formation process? Well, in archaeological jargon, that are the events or activities that created and affected an archaeological site before, during, and after its occupation by humans. So basically, it's going from that photo of the Adolphe at the time it was launched to the way it looks now. How do you get from a sailing ship that is a viable, agent of transport, and how does it become a wreck and end up absorbed into a breakwater and looking the way it looks today? So those forces can be natural and or anthropogenic, and oftentimes you find both are at play on a given wreck site. The Adolphe is a really good example of that, and I think it'd be a great case study. Well, why is that? Well, you're going to find out. A little bit about the Adolphe first. So it's a steel-hulled four-masted barkentine of approximately 3,000 tons, big ship, launched in France in 1902. And only 2 years later, so this is a very young vessel in the grand scheme of things, it wrecks at Newcastle on the Oyster Bank, while again attempting to enter the river. And again, was under tow. And again, the tow parted, they lost control of the ship, and in it went. Now, what's quite interesting about the Adolphe is that it struck the colonist, which, if you will recall, is the same wreck that the Durasdeer crew saw as they bounced across the Oyster Bank. And then it eventually came to rest on the wrecks of the Winduri and the Lindis. And in fact, one of those two wrecks, possibly both, caused the vessel's back to break. So it hit the vessel and it was applying so much pressure down on the keel that it snapped like this. And the stern basically kind of partially broke away. Now, really cool thing about the Adolphe is that there is a vast photo archive of this ship. I mean, from the time it wrecked, basically. So you've got photos of it shortly after it ran aground. And the mast in the foreground, by the way, is another wreck called the Regent Murray. So they're everywhere. I can't stress that enough. Here's another photograph. So this is the breakwater being constructed out to the Adolphe. And there's the Regent Murray's masts right there in the foreground. So you have that photo. You have photos of the breakwater now up against the Adolphe, right? And these are just examples. There's a vast archive of documentation out there related to this. And then today. So you can basically go from 1904 up to the present day. And I have to say that the Adolphe is one of the most photographed shipwrecks in Australia. Probably the only other one that's been photographed more is the Protector at Heron Island. And that's only because it's at Heron Island. It's tropical. There's coral reefs and stuff. But, yeah, so vast photo archive. And not only the exterior, also the interior. So this is a historic photograph of the inside of the vessel. And what you're looking at is that's one of the decks. And then just up above, you can see the beams that supported the deck above. So you've got all the internal spaces, all this sort of thing. And I bet if you looked around, you'd probably find even more photographs showing this vessel both internally and externally. And yeah, over time, you can see these changes and you could really document the disintegration of this vessel from a sailing ship down to what you see today. And the other aspect to this is you could do that sort of study singularly on the Adolphe. But I'm also really quite intrigued by this whole layer cake concept, of shipwreck upon shipwreck upon shipwreck upon shipwreck. So in this case, you've got the Adolphe sitting atop the Lindis, the Winduri, and the Colonist. And then you've got the Kawara, not too far away. So it would be interesting to look at that. It would also be interesting to confirm whether these wrecks are in fact the ones that they're supposed to be. I have no reason to believe that Terry Callan, isn't accurate in his assessment. But you can often find sometimes that the vessel that you thought was this vessel is in fact another one. And one of the ways that you can determine that is archaeologically. You get down there, you get the data, you compare it to the archival resources, and that tells you what you need to know. So I find this really fascinating. And the other thing to consider here too is that these are relatively contemporary wrecks at the time, when photographs and everything were taken. But I'm willing to bet there are wrecks beneath them still. And that happens a lot. Good example is in Florida. Sorry, I go back to Florida because I work there a lot. But there was a Spanish galleon from the 1733 Plate Fleet, which was a fleet of Spanish galleons that were heading to Spain from Mexico and carrying a large consignment of treasure. Got caught in a hurricane. Most of the fleet was pushed ashore and wrecked. One of the sites was found in the 1960s, roughly. A lot of treasure salvage occurred. Not very much in terms of archaeology. People weren't really documenting what they were finding. They were just grabbing all the loot. But there was follow-up archaeology that was done in the 1980s and 90s. And one of the things that they were finding in abundance was prehistoric Native American pottery. Now, the belief originally because they were finding this when they were doing the treasure salvage too, was that the vessel was just carrying pottery. They were bringing it from the New World as maybe a cargo or someone's personal possessions. But when they did stringent archaeological study and they looked at the stratigraphy, what they found was there was an inundated prehistoric site there, and the wreck had landed right on top of it. And then over time, through site formation, things got intermixed. So this is where archaeology is important, because it can confirm things, it can refute other things. Now, I'm going to end this on a wreck that I'm very interested in. This is actually what kick-started this whole thing for me, being interested in the wreck sites up here. And that's the story of the Estermena, or the Extremeña, when it was built. So this vessel was built in what is now modern-day Ecuador. At the time, it was the Viceroyalty of Peru. It was built and launched in 1803. I have now come across information that has led me to know that at least part of its construction was from timbers salvaged from another wrecked Spanish warship called the San Leocadia. So it was launched, and its primary purpose was to serve as a hydrographic vessel. So it was a surveying ship. The Spanish controlled Central and South America at the time, and even though they had occupied this area since the 1500s, there were still large areas of the western coastline of South America they knew nothing about. And so they undertook a series of hydrographic voyages to try to chart all the coastline up and down the coast of South America. So the Extremeña was involved in that. So it was pierced for 12 guns, but it was only armed with 4 at the time. They weren't expecting to be attacked, which was unfortunate due to what happens. We'll find out shortly. So it undertook these voyages, and while it was operating around what was then called Caldera Bay in Chile on the 1st of October, 1804, it was attacked by a brig called the Harrington. Now, what's fun about the Harrington? Well, the Harrington originated in Sydney. That's what's fun about it. It was under the command of William Campbell. Campbell was a merchant based in Sydney, and he had conducted quite a lot of illegal trade with South America during the early 19th century. At the time, Spain had a very strict embargo on its colonies. We were not allowed to trade with anyone other than the Spanish. But of course, people violated that all the time. And Campbell was very heavily involved with that. So in 1803, 1804, it's looking like Spain and Britain are going to go to war. This is during the Napoleonic Wars. It looks like Spain's going to join the side of the French. So that means that Britain and Spain will soon be slugging it out. Campbell realizes this and decides, this might be a good opportunity for me to sail over to the coast of South America and seize some prizes, get myself some prize vessels, bring them back, and get a payout. So he heads over there, and he is told on the way out while in Tahiti that war has indeed been declared between Spain and Britain. Well, there's no truth to any of that. It's all rumor. But he takes it as gospel truth, sails to the coast of South America. While en route, closer to the coastline, finds out that the Extremeña is out there, operating with another survey vessel, and decides he's going to take them. So that's what he does. He sails in. He's heavily gunned. The Extremeña's got 4 cannons and 20 shot. That's all they've got, 20 cannonballs. So they get into a battle that lasts about an hour, but they shoot all their ammunition, and at that point they say, well, we're done. We're going to set the ship on fire and leave. So crew evacuates. They set the Extremeña on fire, and Campbell and his crew managed to get aboard the Extremeña, put the fire out, and take it. So they sail back through Tahiti on the way back, where they find out that there is no war between Spain and Britain. But Campbell decides that, despite that fact, he's going to sneak these vessels to Australia and hide them until he can figure out what to do with them. So he does that. Extremeña ends up down at Jervis Bay, and Campbell heads up to Sydney to find out what's going on. In the meantime, Philip Gidley King, who's the governor of New South Wales, gets wind of all of this. Rumors travel fast, as it turns out. And so by the time Campbell arrives, he knows that he has seized these vessels. He knows that there is no war between Spain and Britain, and Campbell is in big trouble. So he is basically arrested when he arrives. His ship, the Harrington, is impounded, and a vessel goes down to retrieve Ethramenia. And Ethramenia's prize crew actually attempts to escape, but they don't. And so they bring him up to Sydney, and it's kind of fun because I've done a bit of research on this, and so I went to the Defense Ministry archives in Spain, and also went to the Naval Archives in Madrid, and there is some Spanish correspondence talking about this. And one thing that's quite amusing is that they keep referring to both the Harrington and Campbell as the pirata, the pirate. Spanish were not happy about this. They were very upset, in fact. And so this has some pretty potentially nasty ramifications. And King's in a bit of a pickle now because he has stolen goods, basically. There is no state of war between Spain and Britain, and this is looking like it could turn into a major international incident that may very well tip Spain into conflict against Britain. So he writes to the viceroy explaining what has happened, and says, look, we're willing to either give you the vessel back or pay you the value of the vessel. He sends a smaller cutter with the dispatch. It disappears at sea, never seen again or heard from again. So the viceroy doesn't hear from King, and he gets very upset and sends him some correspondence that's fairly direct, wanting to know where his vessel is or money. And so long and short of it is, King ends up buying the vessel, or the government ends up buying it, because Spain and Britain actually do go to war. And at that point, it's considered a prize, and the government buys it and converts it into a colonial schooner. So it begins operating for government business, basically, mostly in New South Wales waters. And so that's what it does. And it is nominally involved in the Rum Rebellion, which is pretty fun. It is the only government vessel in Sydney Harbor when the Rum Rebellion takes place. The commander is ordered to lower Bligh's pennant, which is flying from the vessel. And then Bligh himself is told that he needs to leave the colony and he needs to get on the Ethramenia and get lost, which Bligh balks at, not only because the Ethramenia is incredibly small, but also because they haven't told him where he's supposed to go. And it's not in very good condition at this point, so it's not looking like a good option for him. And one of the other fairly significant things it did was it evacuated the last convicts and settlers from Norfolk Island when the penal colony was closed in 1814, and they were all transferred down to Tasmania. So it had a pretty busy life. And so it came up to Newcastle in 1816. It had come up here to pick up some coal and timber, which was going to be transshipped back down to Sydney. And so it was departing the Hunter River in a northeasterly gale. There was an ebb tide running, and basically the crew kind of lost control of the vessel trying to come out. So they put some anchors down, tried to hold their position. The chain parted, and guess what? It went up on the Oyster Bank, like so many other ships did. And the conditions were bad enough that the vessel started to break up fairly quickly. Now, the crew all got off. They managed to escape. But some of the archival accounts in newspapers indicate that within a few days, the vessel had actually settled in the sand to its deck. So the entire ship basically sank into the sand, which is quite impressive. And there it sat, eventually broke up and disappeared from sight. Now, this is what really got me fired up. Sometimes you run across nuggets like this, and it's the best thing ever. So this is a chart that was done by a Royal Navy officer named Jeffreys, and it was done in 1816, which happened to be the same year the Ethramenia wrecked. what's really nice is, so that's the entrance to the river. You can kind of see Stockton there looking kind of like an island to the right, and you can see Newcastle there to the left. The really cool part, though, this is a close-up of it, is that he very kindly marked the location of the wreck. Thanks, Jeffries. That's the best. In my line of business, you love things like this because it makes your searching a lot easier. So we have this really great archival resource saying where the shipwreck should be, understanding that it's not necessarily accurate. And in fact, I had some guys who do geographic information systems or GIS. They attempted to do an overlay on the modern landscape with this chart. Had a lot of trouble doing that because there aren't very many landscapes on this chart that match with the modern landscape. And a lot has changed, obviously. Breakwaters have been built, things have been dredged. Stockton has evolved in terms of its shape and extent. So that's made things a bit difficult. But I did some quick and dirty overlays just for fun. And so what you've got is a satellite image of the entrance to the river. You can see the North Breakwater quite prominently. And you will notice that the Estremina is sitting very, very close to the breakwater, which I am not pleased about at all, because that's not where I want a shipwreck to be. Where I want it to be is where the Dundee is, where it's kind of out of the footprint of the breakwater, and also not potentially sitting in the shipping channel, which is where my projection is showing it's sitting at the moment. Now, bear in mind, this is not gospel. This is kind of quick and dirty. There's a bit of discrepancy there. And it could very easily be on the Stockton Beach side of the breakwater, away from the breakwater. That'd be great. Some very significant challenges to consider here. One of the big tools that we use when searching for shipwrecks in maritime archaeology is a piece of equipment called a marine magnetometer. And what this is basically it's a glorified metal detector. You either drag it behind the boat or you mount it to the boat. And what it does is it detects concentrations of iron. And the Earth has a magnetic field, as we all know. Things like cannons and chain and iron masts and that sort of thing, they create very localized variations in the magnetic field. So you can pick them up and you can actually plot them. You can contour them. So we normally use that piece of equipment, and it proves quite handy looking for wrecks because oftentimes they have anchors and cannons and chains and fasteners and all this other stuff. The problem comes when you have a lot of iron in one spot. And as I have already demonstrated, that breakwater is basically built of a lot of iron from shipwrecks and subsequent building material that was probably used in its construction. So if you try to use a magnetometer anywhere around that breakwater, you're not going to detect anything. It will be overwhelmed by all the magnetics there. So that's probably not going to help. So I'm rethinking this at the moment and trying to figure out how I might go about doing this. But yeah, it's a fun quandary. I would love to find it. One of the biggest reasons is it's a very historically significant vessel. It played a really interesting role. It would be one of only two known Spanish shipwrecks in Australian waters, in that it was Spanish built. It is the only documented victim of Australian piracy, which is awesome. And for me personally, because I have an interest in ship construction, and particularly Spanish New World ship construction, I would be very interested to see how this vessel was built and what they built it from. My master's thesis project was on a Spanish ship built in Campeche in Mexico. And that vessel was made from mahogany and Spanish cedar. Spanish traditionally used oak. That was their preferred shipbuilding timber. But in the New World, they had this vast resource of timber they could use. So they adopted it, and they started building ships out of it. So I know what a lot of Mexican-built ships were made from. I don't know what Ecuadorian or Peruvian vessels were made from. So that would be interesting. I'd be very keen to see what they did, because that's not documented. They don't really, at least with the Estremina specifically, they don't say what they built it from, other than it was built partly from salvaged timber. So that would be a fun one to do. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential here. I mean, there's a vast data set of shipwrecks in Newcastle, specifically the Oyster Bank, Stockton Beach area. A lot of different ways you could approach it, a lot of different things you could look at specifically and more broadly. And I think, we've just scratched the surface. And there are wrecks that are known. Those are probably the best ones to start with, but there are ones that haven't been found yet. And even though there are challenges with the Estermina, I believe in this maxim, you don't know until you look. So the fact that it might be under the breakwater isn't going to dissuade me. I'm very keen to actually get up here and look and see if I can find it, have a go. Might not find it. Then again, might get lucky and find it. So don't know till you look. So yeah, I guess the bottom line is there's some cool stuff here. And I hope to get up here at some point and do some of that cool stuff. Thanks.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I'd like to open up for questions. I'm going to leap in and shamelessly use my position as chair to ask the first question. It seems to me that this body of water, from what you've been saying, is both the worst and the best place to get shipwrecked, right? The worst because there's so many of them. The best because every example you gave, every crew member got off safely. Is that a fair assessment of this location, or?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly were some fairly tragic wrecks, like the Clara is a really good example. There were, I think, 66 people on that vessel. One survived. Right. And a strange irony, he was saved by 2 people, one of whom was the only survivor of the Dunbar. Right. So there were instances where there was rather significant loss of life. But yes, I think if your ship survived getting over the Oyster Bank and managed to get pushed into the shallows at Stockton Beach, then yeah, your chances of survival probably went up a considerable bit. Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Deb?
I've got 2 really quick questions.
Yep.
So when the colonial government bought the Estremina, who did they buy it from?
Well, they were going to buy it from the Spanish originally. But in the end, I'm not quite sure. It's an interesting sort of round robin quandary there, isn't it? As I understand it, the government paid the money for it with the idea it would be held in trust for the Spanish government. But then shortly after that decision was made, they found out that war had been declared.
Yeah, so now it's a prize.
Yeah, never mind. We're not going to do that. That money probably didn't actually get paid. It probably went right back into the coffers. Yeah.
And the second one was the Adolphe. How many masts did it have?
4.
Because in the last photo of it, it only had 2.
Yeah.
So do people plunder these vessels for things that are useful?
Yeah. When they were building the breakwater, and I don't actually know the sequence of events, but some of those masts might have gone by the board. They might have actually fallen off.
Some of them were deliberately removed.
Some of them were deliberately removed. That's right.
Safety issues.
Yeah. Because when the breakwater got out there, you were in danger of a mast falling over and
people would climb up them and bits them all off. Yeah. And also they often salvaged them for reuse.
Yeah.
Because at the time, Stockton had 3 active
shipbuilders. That'd be a boon.
Oh, yeah.
So that was, and also given salvage rights for boats on the beach as well.
Right.
That's an interesting thing too, is salvage, the whole process of.
Yeah, because I mean, there's also not only just the ones that wrecked, there's a number that floundered, but they were then refloated, taken around to the shipyards and repaired and put back into service.
Yeah.
We might go online. We've got a couple of questions online. Kit, would you like to start us off?
Oh, yeah. That was great. Really interesting. I've just got 3 things to mention. It's amazing, and it underscores the importance of coal, that they would persist with such a dangerous waterway.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an extraordinary number of shipwrecks. I think there's also questions about the sort of vagaries of flotsam and jetsam and what is legally allowed to be taken from a sunken vessel and at what point. And I think that's an interesting issue. Also, I wonder if the breakwater is now a marine habitat. And that's a kind of thought that came to mind because they're often sinking large sort of vessels to try and stimulate marine life. But also my own work is the early 19th century Caribbean. So I do a bit of work in Berbice, and I'm just curious about the Scots connection to Berbice and the naming of that ship. Because there's an awful lot of Scottish planters in Berbice, especially earlier during the time of enslavement. So I was wondering if you knew anything about that.
I don't, but I can probably speculate in that the first voyage that Berbice made was to the West Indies. So I wonder if there's that connection. In the same way that Durasdeer's initial name was City of Lahore, and it was primarily trade between Scotland and British India. So that's my guess, but I don't really know for sure.
Yeah.
In terms of marine habitat, I will say most shipwrecks I've worked on, and particularly historic wrecks that have been exposed for some time, they do tend to have very well-established reef ecosystems. And I think, I don't know why that is. It's just, I think over time they get, macrofauna that kind of grows, and that kind of creates the basis for the entire ecosystem. So you get, there was a shipwreck in Florida, again, 19th century wreck sitting off the beach, about 5 meters of water. And I remember that it had everything on it from, little tiny nudibranchs all the way to a couple of nurse sharks, American nurse sharks that were,
Wow.
2.5 meters long. And that's because it had been there for so long. And
I'm going to go out there and check it all out.
Yeah, I think you should. I mean, I'm quite interested to check it out. I mean, most stone breakwaters I've been diving or snorkeling on tend to have quite a lot of marine life on them. So, yeah.
Nancy.
Thank you very much. Just do be cautious because it's also known as a shark nursery around there. So, and not just nurse sharks. So take it a bit easy. And Kit, it's also a habitat for cats. And I think that's something that our colleague Kate Senior has published on, where the cats, I think there was a symbiosis between the fishers and the cats because they were throwing away their fish heads and so on. And then it was deemed that they were problematic, and there was a culling process carried on by shooting, which was very controversial. So back to your topic, ballast. I was really interested to hear that several of the ships you mentioned were in ballast as they were coming into the harbour and wrecked because they were coming for the shipments of coal. Firstly, I don't know that much about how ballast works. I know that they have a ballast yard in Stockton, and so do they lighten the ballast before they come in? And could that have been part of the problem with the capacity to navigate effectively getting into the harbour, I wonder? And when you're diving, or when you're exploring a wreck, is there interest and evidence in the ballast as well? Again, the Stockton Ballast Grounds is sort of known locally for having an array of stone from all over the world. And so that we have this incredible little geological collection that is not related to Newcastle in any other way except because of it being a coal port. So, yeah, ballast.
Ballast, yeah. So oftentimes it depended on the port. If the vessel, the vessel's draft wasn't deep enough that it would create an issue as it came through, they'd normally keep the ballast in the ship because, of course, they're more stable. You reduce the ballast, the stability changes substantially. So they'd often keep the ballast in, come into port, offload the ballast. Normally it was a ballast dump, or they'd bring it ashore because it could be recycled, of course, into other ships. And then the cargo was put in. Basically, as the ballast is coming out, they're putting cargo in to match the weight. Having said that, there have been ports historically that were difficult for vessels to get into, so they would sometimes have to lighten and just discard their ballast just off the port somewhere overboard, and then they'd go in. But as you say, that makes the vessel inherently more unstable, and if you got nasty weather or any sort of conditions like that, that potentially creates a lot of problems. Ballast analysis, yes, there are people who do this. And in fact, one of the sites that I didn't work on, but my colleagues in the Maritime Museum did, was up at Endeavour Reef on the barrier reef where the Endeavour ran aground during Cook's voyage. And among the many things that they found up there were several blocks of kentlage, which is iron ballast. Because, of course, when they ran aground, they had to lighten the vessel to get it off the reef. So they dumped tons of material overboard. So there was iron kentlage ballast that was dumped, but there was also stone ballast. And some of that ballast was greenstone from New Zealand, which helped confirm. It was pretty well known that this was where Endeavour had run aground, but that just helped confirm that because there was this greenstone that they had taken on in New Zealand, and then they discarded it. In fact, when we were working on the Endeavour X site in Rhode Island, that's something that I think if we went back and did additional work on, we would look for. There is stone ballast on that wreck, but we haven't investigated that part of the wreck site. We've kind of focused our attention in other areas. But I think if we did additional work, that's something we would look for, is the type of ballast and the type of stone we're finding, and whether that would indicate, that would jive with the historical record of where Endeavour went during Cook's voyage and subsequent.
Thank you.
Just talking about the Extramina, if you looking at other maps throughout Stockton's history, that point where the second ballast breakwater has gone in, in that early period when Extramina was sailing, some of the maps show a quite substantial sandbank. It's not just spotted islands of sand, it's a solid sandbank. So it's quite possible that in the period where she went down, she may have been covered by the sandbank and then the breakwater built on top. So it's possible that she's still under there. And just a second comment going back to more modern wrecks, while the Pashabolka was going up on Nobby's Beach, two other ships were out in Stockton Bight and almost went up in exactly the same spot as the Cygna.
Wow.
One of them was literally couldn't have been more than 100 foot offshore, and it was rolling. I've never seen any ship coming into harbour in many years of living in Stockton listing as badly as that ship had.
Wow.
I'm sure they needed new engines after they came out because there's no way they weren't running them over spec.
Yeah.
And another one was within probably another half a kilometre of that one, nearly went up as well. The entire shoreline of Stockton Beach, was full of people not watching the Pashabolka. They were watching these two ships trying not to go up almost on top of the Cygna.
Wow.
So it's still a dangerous beach in the bit of sea in the wrong environment. So
That's amazing.
yeah. So a little bit of local history on that one because no one ever talks about that. But like I've never seen two ships struggle as much to keep off the beach as those two.
Amazing. They held off as long as they did.
Yeah. I've literally never seen ships listing as badly as that. And these were big bulk carriers.
Yeah. Wow. A lot of windage on them then. I bet that wasn't helping.
Yeah. I mean, we were thought we were all watching the Cygna Part 2.
Yeah.
Because one of them got so close.
Other questions? I've recently changed my home and contents insurer, and I thought the forms for that were complicated.
Yeah.
But now that I've seen the Lloyd's forms, I realised I've gotten off quite lightly. The degree of detail there, what was that? Why did they require that level of detail?
For insurance purposes. I think that was a big part of it. The British were pretty stringent about, I think most European countries were, to be honest, but the British particularly were quite stringent about how their vessels were built. And they would be rated according to their build. So, what timber they were manufactured from, whether they had iron bracing, framing and that sort of thing. All of these things factored into what the vessel would be rated as. And that in turn had ramifications on how high they could insure it for. And whether you could sail in specific waters, whether it had to be coastal waters or open water or international, all of that depended upon your rating with Lloyd's. And if you violated it, and several people did, let's be honest, and you're shipwrecked, well, too bad. When you went for the insurance claim, you weren't going to get it because they look and go, oh, your vessel's E1. Well, you shouldn't have been sailing across the Atlantic. Too bad. And that's why it was so stringent. And they just now. Sadly, I wish it were like that for all ships I've looked at. It's not. As you get closer to modern day, the records tend to be much more detailed and much more comprehensive.
Right.
But the further back you go, it just kind of. I mean, you probably had records like that at some point, but they've just been lost. And so yeah, we don't. For example, the South Australian, which is a wreck we worked on down in Victor Harbor in South Australia. I contacted Lloyd's to ask if they had a first survey record for that ship, and they did, which was great. They had one. But it didn't have that level of detail. It didn't have the timber measurements or anything. And I had recorded all that information on the wreck. And it was really sad because when it was named South Australian and had changed ownership, it had actually been in operation for about 16 years by that point under two different names. But they didn't have anything related to the vessel when it was built. And that's in the first survey, that's normally when you find all that information. So it's right after the vessel's built, it's surveyed for the first time. That is when all that really comprehensive information ends up being listed. And they just didn't have it for the vessel. So it's unfortunate. But we're still confident. Still confident we got it.
Right. Really,
we found other things.
Okay, we've come unfortunately to the end of our time, but please join me in thanking James for a really, really interesting thing.
Thank you. Okay.
And it's nice to end the this year's seminar series on a topic that has such great local, local resonance. And this is it for us for this year. But the seminar will be back next year, bigger and better than ever before, and we hope to see you then.